Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi to the Lanian pre-release. Lanian is an Anemo Catelyst 4-star character that's going to be coming in the second half of patch 5.3. Base HP 9,244, base attack 251, base defense 580. As we're going to see later, Lanian is an attack scaling shielder, which means she's not an on-fielder, so having relatively low defensive stats isn't that big of a deal. However, she does have somewhat long animations, and so it could still be a bit of a problem. But then again, she has the upside of basically jumping in the air during her animations, so her longer animations won't necessarily leave her vulnerable to getting hit. It's a lot closer to a Kazuha situation than a Kole situation, both of which being characters that have pretty long animations, but one of them feeling much worse than the other. Let's just put it that way. She has an attack percent ascension. So, she's a Catalyst, which means that she has Anemo-infused normal attacks, and the scaling on those normal attacks is pretty awful. As we're gonna see later, what she provides is gonna give her a decent amount of versatility, so there's going to be a lot of different teams where you can play her, and that's going to include teams that use Anemo drivers, teams like Aggravate with Fischl plus Beto, or Fischl plus Lisa, or I guess Fischl plus Auron, teams like Taser, and in those situations, having relatively low scaling on your normal attacks isn't really that big of a deal, because you're not really building full attack anyways. And whether you're building EM or attack, your Anemo character in those teams isn't doing that big of a portion of your damage. Most of your damage is coming from the rest of your team, and so her relatively low scalings on normal attacks don't really matter too much. They're not something you have to put too much thought into. Next up, elemental skill Swallow Wisp Pinion Dance. Summoning forth the Swallow Wisp Shield, a secret art passed down across generations, Lanian dashes forward and, upon making contact with her target, will leap back into the air. The Swallow Wisp Shield's damage absorption scales based on her attack and has 250% absorption efficiency against Anemo damage. While in midair due to the effect of her elemental skill, pressing her skill again or pressing normal attack will cause Lanian to hurl her Feather Moon rings at an opponent, and they will spin between nearby opponents twice upon hit, dealing Anemo damage. Holding the skill will cause it to behave differently. Old enter aiming mode. Basically, you can think of it like a Kazuha skill, but instead of grouping, you get a shield. Shield duration is 12.5 seconds, cooldown is 16. I think a lot of people are gonna see this and be like, oh no, she doesn't have 100% uptime, bad shield. And the thing is, that doesn't really matter that much for an Anemo unit. When you look at a character like Zhongli, for example, you don't really care to swap into him right before your carry. You don't really gain anything from it. And so, a longer shield allows you to swap into him before you swap to your supports, and still have the shield up for your whole carry's uptime. Lanian, on the other hand, is an Anemo unit. That means that in almost every team you're gonna play with her, you'll be using Vivi. Now, Vivi's duration on the debuff is 10 seconds, which means that after 10 seconds of uptime on your carry, you're kind of not doing that much damage anymore. In other words, the fact that the shield duration is shorter than the cooldown doesn't matter that much, because you don't really want to stay on your other character much longer than your Vivi uptime anyways. However, obviously, the shield duration is not the only number that matters when it comes to the shield. The strength of the shield also matters. So, how big is Lanian's shield? And how does that compare to other shielders? We can compare it to Zhongli. So Zhongli on a build, like a usual Zhongli build, where you would put him on Favonius with double HP plus like crit rate main stat, should be around 40k. And the reason why I'm not looking at the maximum shield that you could get on Zhongli is going to be the same reason why I won't be looking at the maximum shield you can get on Lanian, because you shouldn't be using, outside of a very few select teams where you don't care about the energy whatsoever, you shouldn't be using Black Tassel Zhongli with triple HP. You should be using Fav pretty much always. Shield percent, he is going to be at 30% from TOM, plus maybe 10% average from his passive, which means that a practical Zhongli shield is generally going to hover between 20 and 25k. In comparison, so a practical Lanian shield is going to be about half as tanky as a practical Zhongli shield. Now, because of the absorption mechanic that we haven't looked at yet, but I guess we can read it now. When the dash from the skill hits a target, if it interacts with Hydro, Pyro, Cryo, or Electro, so basically it's an absorption thing, the Swallow Wisp shield shield will undergo elemental absorption with a converted shield absorbing damage from the corresponding element with 250% efficiency. So basically, if you swirl Electro with your skill, you'll get an Electro shield instead of an Anemo shield. So technically this could be 150%, in which case it will be tankier than Zhongli's shield, but that's not a reliable thing. However, this is C0 Lanyan. So before we even start looking at the burst, or I guess we might as well get the burst out of the way, sure. Lustrous Moonrise. Lanyan creates a Feather Moon Swallow array, pulling in nearby opponents and objects and dealing multiple instances of Anemo damage. Yeah, this is pretty much Hazel's ult. There's not much to say about it. And then Ascension 4, Elemental Skill and Burst deal increased damage equal to 309% and 774% of Lanyan's EM respectively. That means that looking at exclusively her damage, she will potentially have build paths that involve some EM, but keep in mind that the EM doesn't affect the strength of the shield, and in most situations where you're playing Lanyan, you're playing her because of the shield. So I'll talk about it a little bit more later on, but it's mostly not all that relevant in my eyes. Anyways, let's talk about her constellation. C1, after triggering elemental absorption, her skill will produce another Feather Moon ring when they are thrown at opponents. Hog, skill do more damage. C2, while the Swallow-Wisp shield is active, when your active party members' normal attacks deal damage, 40% of the shield's damage absorption will be restored, up to its original maximum damage absorption. This effect can occur once every 2 seconds. That's kind of a big deal, actually. What that means is that if your shield takes a hit but survives, doing a normal attack will add 5k shielding back, which is kind of a lot, actually. What that means is that assuming that you never get hit by more than like whatever the max damage absorption of your shield is at a time, like if you're not getting hit by attacks that do 20k damage or 2 attacks that do 10k at the same time, as long as your shield is surviving, you can refresh it pretty easily, and the maximum total amount that it can have, assuming you never end up overcapping your shield, is like double Zhongli's shield. I think in a lot of situations, people tend to get hit by a bunch of attacks in a row when they get hit. And so I would be careful not to assume that Lanyan's shield at C2 is just gonna be 40k. I think in most cases, you'll get either 0, 1, or 2 refreshes. A lot of people are going to compare the way that her C2 works to a character like Thoma, and I want to just quickly talk about the main differences between the two. The main upside with Thoma's shield is that it's a shield that provides you pretty much unconditional resistance to interruption. The fact that it keeps refreshing even after it gets broken means that you're pretty much always standing there with a shield, which means your incoming attacks will very, very rarely, if ever, hit you while you're unshielded. And when you get hit while you're shielded, you don't get interrupted, no matter how much the attack would have staggered you. The only exception to that is if that attack does multiple hits, because the first hit can break the shield and the second hit is hitting you while you're unshielded. And so the main purpose of using a shielder like Thoma in a team is to have a more reliable resistance to interruption. With Lanyan, you don't actually get a more reliable resistance to interruption, because once your shield is broken, you lose that resistance to interruption. But in exchange for that, you get the potential to have a much larger amount of damage mitigated. Next up, C3, which I believe is the skill. Yeah, there's about a 20% increase to the power of the shield, which is nice. It can be the equivalent of a lot more, because if your shield breaks, your C2 stops doing anything. If your shield survives because of the C3, right? If you get hit by something that does 14,000 damage, or by 2 attacks that do 7k, at C0, you would have lost the shield. At C3, you don't, and then your C2 starts proccing and building it back up. C4, after Lanyan uses her burst, EM of all party members increased by 60. That's fine, I guess. C5 is burst damage. It's okay. And finally, C6 gives her skill 1 more charge. I don't think it actually matters in most cases, because it won't really be enough to do 2 skills per rotation. When you look at a character like Lynette with a 12-second skill cooldown, who has one of the constellations that gives her 1 more charge, characters with 10 or 12-second skill cooldown being given 1 additional charge on their skill means that you have more flexibility in terms of when you use your skills while still maintaining 2 skills per rotation. Same thing for Yelan, right? Yelan's C1 tends to be fairly significant for a bunch of different teams, because it allows you to get both skills on Yelan without having to swap back to her after 10 seconds. Lanyan, on the other hand, has a cooldown of 16 seconds. What that means is if you do use 2 skills, you won't get 2 skills back until 32 seconds later, which means it's not actually enough to allow you to use 2 skills per rotation. Does that mean that it's bad? I mean, not necessarily. It means that if your shield gets broken, you can swap back to her, which is nice. Technically, this means that she'll synergize a little bit better with characters like Neuvillette, I guess, where you could potentially swap back to her every 12.5 seconds and just do 1 skill per rotation. Right? If you use your skill every 12-ish seconds, right, you'll get 1 skill at 0, 1 at 12, 1 at 24, 1 at 36. And here your remaining cooldown, you're gonna have 1 charge, 16 seconds. So here, you're basically out one charge, 4 seconds cooldown on your second one. Here, 1 charge, 6-second cooldown, or sorry, 8-second cooldown on your second one. Here, 1 charge, 12-second cooldown on your second one. And then at 48, it'll get back to 1. So basically, you can do 5 12-second rotations with her before you run out of skills, right? From the fact that you start with 2, even if they're 16 seconds, which is nice, I guess, because in most situations, when you're playing Neuvillette after this much, the enemies are just dead. So that's kind of all you need. So it does allow you a little bit more flexibility in that sense, but I don't feel like that's all that necessary to begin with. It's an okay constellation, but looking at like the other C6s for like the good 4-star characters that have been released lately, where you look at Auron, C6, 30% attack to your carry and a little bit more damage on him, that's kind of nice. Gaming, C6, 80 CV, that's pretty good. So C6 is obviously really good, right? So compared to those, the C6 is a bit worse. I like that. I'm happy with that. I don't like it when new 4-star characters are constellation gated in terms of their value. And so I'm pretty happy with an underwhelming C6. Now, her C2 is not underwhelming. And because she's getting released on a rerun banner, and because she's available for Lantern Rite, there's going to be a lot of people that end up getting Lanyan, but that do not have her C2. So, is she bad without her C2? Not at all. Her C2 is going to make her defensive utility much stronger, but the reality is that even at C0, her defensive utility is still kind of good enough. And she also gets so much value out of the additional things she provides on top of her defensive utility. Well, she doesn't actually really have anything all that valuable in her kit in and of itself, outside of her shielding, right? Her damage isn't really the greatest. But as it turns out, sometimes, just by virtue of having a specific element and or weapon type, a character becomes much stronger. And that is indeed the case for Lanyan. She's an Anemo and Catelyst, which means she has access to VV and TTDS. And as it turns out, that's pretty good. Right now, we have other characters that have access to VV and TTDS. There's 2 relevant ones right now. When you look at what they provide, Hazo doesn't tend to see much play, and Sucrose isn't a particularly popular unit among the casual player base, but she's a very strong unit that definitely sees a decent amount of play in both in the speedrunning community and just as a good unit for people that don't hate her like me. But what is it exactly that makes Sucrose an appealing unit to have? There's obviously the fact that she's an Anemo and Catelyst. There's the fact that she gives an EM buff. There's the fact that she has a bit of grouping. And the main reason why she sees plays over the other Anemo alternatives in speedrunning is that her animations are really short. When you're looking at Molani speedruns, for example, the clears tend to be so fast that just a jump into plunge animation from Kazuha is gonna double your clear time. And that's where Sucrose shines. Lanyan doesn't have those short animations, but she does provide defensive utility. And looking at the other Anemo options, she's pretty much the only one. Lanyan is our first non-healer defensive utility Anemo unit. And while healers are nice to have, they don't provide you with resistance to interruption, which tends to be a pretty big deal. There's a lot of characters that are very reliant on resistance to interruption to work properly. Even characters that are less reliant on it very much appreciate having it. And on top of that, having resistance to interruption on a defensive unit that is also not only on your team because of her defensive utility, that can justify her slot offensively as well, is really nice. When you look at the sort of value that Zhongli provides to teams, it's pretty much only his shield. He has resistance shred, but 20% resistance shred is not enough by itself to justify a team slot. characters that are getting most of their value from resistance shred all have more shred than 20%. You look at Shilonen with her 36 plus damage percent buffs with the artifact set. You look at VV, right, as a general rule, 40%. And so in other words, Lanyan can be considered a more offensive focused alternative to a character like Zhongli in teams where obviously your carry is a swirlable element. And then on top of that, there are even situations where defensively her shield is competitive, if not stronger than Zhongli's shield with her C2. All in all, Lanyan isn't a character with a kit that's all that outstanding. At the end of the day, she's a shielder that doesn't really have relevant off-field application or that much damage. But just because animal characters currently don't provide any real defensive utility outside of healing, just having a character fill that niche is already inherently pretty valuable. And then on top of that, they decided to make her a Catelyst, which means she has access to TDDS. And TDDS is a really, really good weapon. Unlike Elegy or Freedom Sworn or Shalonen's Signature, it's not a 5-star weapon, which means everyone can have it. It's a free weapon that anyone can have. And so her having access to it is a pretty big deal. I guess technically, I didn't mention Lynette's taunt when I was talking about Anemo units having defensive utility, but that's because taunts are fake in Genshin. With all of that out of the way, let's get into the weapons. TTDS, best in slot. Don't use anything else. There's an asterisk to that. Okay. So obviously with TDDS, your shield is going to be smaller than if you were using an attack percent Catalyst or a 5-star Catalyst or even a 4-star Catalyst, but it's worth it. The 48% attack to your carry is just way too good. The one relevant exception to this is when you're playing her in a team that doesn't have an attack scaler that can benefit from TDDS. Because her damage isn't really all that high, but it's also not completely insignificant, you can kind of choose between going for a damage weapon and just having a bit of a nuke on your burst, I guess, or just trying to min-max your shield, or going for a utility weapon that helps the rest of your team. I'd say that as a general rule, leaning towards utility weapons will probably be your best bet. So I would generally have Fav as the default option for Neuvillette teams and other such non-attack scaling carries. But obviously if you have Citlali's signature, right, that gives 28% damage, right, that will also be good. Realistically, it'll be better than Codex, but not worth going for. Like, don't go for this just for Lanyan. Don't go for this at all, honestly. TDDS is too good. And I'm not gonna go through all of the other weapons. I'll just say others. It's something you can do, like, if you really want her to deal more damage, you can do that. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but that's not where she shines. Yeah, I guess I should also include Chrono Amber. If you're playing a team that doesn't need TTDS and you're not playing any healers and you want a little bit of healing, it's also something that you can use. Anyways, artifact sets, VV. I honestly can't think of any team where you wouldn't want to use VV. The main argument would be, what if you use Lanyan in a team where your main damage dealer is not a character that benefits from VV? But my retort to that would be, why the f are you playing Lanyan in those teams? If that is what you end up doing, I'd say you're choosing between more personal damage or team buff. So maybe Emblem if you want personal. I don't know. It's I'd probably lean towards a Noblesse, though. You could also use an Atlan set, that's true, but I guess it's fine if you're not using an attack carry. Don't use TOM. She doesn't hit all field, so the buff and, both the attack buff and the shield strength buff on TOM are going to only last 3 seconds. Artifact stats. Attack, attack, attack. I think this is almost always going to be the case. Technically, you can go for her personal damage, and if you end up playing her in a taser team, you can even use some EM. But going back to the previous question, if your character is there for damage, why is it Lanyan? She's a very straightforward character. She's an attack scaling shielder. Just give her some attack to scale her shield. Otherwise, you can go for your Sens over attack Sens if you're on Noblesse and you care about getting your burst of rotation, or crit rate Sens or crit rate circlet over attack circlet if you're on Fav. But as a general rule, just stick to triple attack. And finally, we have teams. And honestly, there's just too many. Lanyan is gonna fit in like so many different cores because there's a lot of teams that want VV, and in pretty much all of those teams, being able to get your defensive unit from the Anemo slot instead of a different slot allows you some flexibility in team building, which means that there's gonna be at least one viable Lanyan team. So for example, aggravate teams, Lanyan will be pretty pog. Using Lanyan is gonna mean that instead of being forced to get your defensive utility from like Kirara or Baiju, if you're looking for defensive utility for your electro carries, you'll still be able to play Nahida. I want to quickly talk about a few specific teams where I have more, I guess, pointed statements to make. So the first one is probably going to be Arlecchino. Arlecchino is going to really like Lanyan. Right now, when you look at your team options for Arlecchino, you have very little wiggle room for defensive utility. Arlecchino is a character that can be healed, which means that defensive utility can potentially matter on her even more. And she's pretty much tight at the hip with Bennett. And so usually you're looking at Vape, Chevreuse, or like Monopyro cores. In Monopyro cores, you can use Zhongli as your shield, and that's kind of it. In Chevreuse, you don't have a shield option. In Vape, Xingqiu is damage mitigation, but damage reduction when you can't be healed isn't as good as shielding. Damage reduction can be better than shielding because it doesn't have an upper limit in terms of how much damage you can mitigate as long as you keep healing through it. But if you can't heal, then it's worse. And then on top of that, Xingqiu's long burst cooldown doesn't line up well with Arlecchino's ability to potentially go as short as like 16, 15 seconds on her rotations. So all in all, looking at defensive options for Arlecchino, it's pretty much only Zhongli. So what sort of teams will you have? Well, you'll have maybe something like this. In a team like this, Lanyan wouldn't be an upgrade because you already have VV. But in pretty much every other alternative, Lanyan would be an upgrade. So this, Lanyan would be an upgrade. This, Lanyan would be an upgrade. I guess you can look at this, and here Lanyan being an upgrade is a little bit more up in the air because getting swirl setups could potentially be rough. We don't have that much information about her ICD and gauge application, so I'm not entirely sure how the setups would work. I'll have to test it on release, so I'm looking forward to that. But Lanyan could potentially be an upgrade here. Point being, Lanyan's gonna give Arlecchino a lot more options when it comes to her defensive utility. And while Citlali's release will also give Arlecchino more options, Lanyan, unlike Citlali, is going to be available for free, like just from the selectable Lantern Rite stuff. So for people with relatively newer accounts or that are saving for a specific upcoming character, Lanyan's release is going to be really nice for Arlecchino. Obviously, this can also apply to other power carries like Linny, for example, but I don't want to go in too much detail for that because it's pretty straightforward. And then I also want to talk about Neuvillette. When you look at your available options for defensive utility for Neuvillette, right? When you're looking at optional Neuvillette teams, you pretty much always have Neuvillette for Arena, and then Shredders, right? That's kind of what you're looking for, right? This is the like most offensive focused version of it. But a lot of people will do this instead, or this instead. If you're looking for a team that has that defensive utility, right, where you're using Zhongli, or, I mean, technically you could use another shielder, but Zhongli tends to be the one that slots in the best right now. Your best bets are going to be Xilonen or Kazuhan for the second slot. If you were instead to use Lanyan, your best bet would be Xilonen. How do those two compare? Looking at something like this versus Lanyan Xilonen. Kazuha and Xilonen pretty much provide more or less the same amount of value in terms of damage gain. And then Zhongli provides less value than Lanyan. He provides less shred, and even in a team where you don't have TTDS's value, Zhongli doesn't have another offensive bonus. You can put him on like Petra or Cinder City, but Petra tends to be a massive pain in the ass on Zhongli. But even with Cinder City's buff plus the shred, it's still less value than Lanyan. On top of that, Lanyan, much like Kazuha, has the ability to get you your third stack if you get hit by an element, which is pretty nice. Now, as far as I understand, her absorption priority is the default one, so it'll only do anything if you get hit by a pyro enemy, but it's still a nice little upside. All in all, Lanyan is going to give you more options for high investment Neuvillette teams with defensive utility. But also, if you're looking at relatively new account where you just got Neuvillette, you don't really have other 5 stars, you're just looking for a team to make, a lot of them right now are using Sucrose. Not because Sucrose has great synergy, just because she's VV. And Lanyan is just gonna fill that slot, but better. And honestly, I don't really want to go through all the teams. Like I said, she's a VV unit that gives you defensive utility. That's gonna pretty much provide you with the same type of value in every team where you can use it. But that doesn't mean I'm done yapping. We still have another important thing to talk about, which is how good is she as a whole? Like how valuable is she to get on an account? And honestly, she's kind of the GOAT. Lanian is one of the best 4-stars that have been released lately, and I actually think that she's relatively competitive with the good 1.0 4-stars. Assuming I'm not like completely misunderstanding a part of her kit, which like I'm hoping isn't the case, she feels a lot like Chevreuse, where like that's an actual good character we get there. And unlike Chevreuse, you get most of her value without her Constellations. As much as her C2 is really good defensively, I do think that most people will be able to get away without needing it. I will be making a video on Lantern Rite selection before the Lantern Rite starts. So if you're unsure whether to get Lanian or another character in there, make sure you subscribe because I'll be talking about that in an upcoming video. But if you have most of the other good 4-stars already at C6, she's definitely something you should be considering. He is a pretty strong character, and I'm pretty happy to see that. She fulfills a niche that is currently pretty much empty, and she does it pretty well. All in all, I'm looking forward to her release, and I hope all of you are as well. That's pretty much going to be it for today. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned a thing or two, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.